Hi there. I'm going to talk to you today about the similarities and differences between French naturalism and American naturalism. So we'll begin with some of the similarities and then move on to the differences. As you know, the first major French naturalist novel is probably this one, Germiny Lacerteux. So it was published by the Goncourt brothers in 1865. Just to let you have a look at that there. So as you can see just from the cover, this is the kind of world that it described. And the preface to Germiny Lacerteux is in a sense the starting point for naturalism. You could say it kind of kick-started naturalism in France. So just looking at the cover, you have a very ordinary scene, an urban scene, and the naturalists tended to focus on urban scenes, and especially the plight of the poor, right? The underprivileged, the underdog. And here you see them also in a rather lascivious pose, and that's typical of the naturalists, both in America and in France. They tended to emphasize, well, what were known as the vices in those days, and especially the seventh deadly sin, the sin of lust. As you can see here in the picture, and it's a movement that tended to emphasize the animal drives, the instincts, those passions and drives that are similar in the animal kingdom. So in a sense, man was described as a sophisticated animal at best. Right, so you also get the impression, right, that they're in some kind of, well, it looks like a restaurant, but it also looks a bit like a drinking den. And Zola's L'Assommoir, means drinking den or gin palace. It's where the poor people went to forget their sorrows, by drinking themselves into a stupor. So from the start you have a focus on the seamier side of life. You have a strong focus on the predicament of the working class, the underprivileged. And both Zola and the Goncourt brothers wanted to suggest that the terrors that the working class underwent were as worthy of interest, and they were something that would make people feel sorry for the working class. So they mentioned before this, the literature tended to focus on tragedies in the upper class, and the Goncourt brothers suggest in their introduction to Germiny Lacerteux that the working class can make you cry as much, and that so there is a kind of equality between the classes on that level, and that it can move us as much, at least as much, as the plights of the rich. So in both countries, naturalism came across as a kind of science-based version of realism, right? The realism that already existed in the 19th century became more science-based, more seamy, right? There was more of an emphasis on the sadness and dirt of cities. So even though both movements tended to want to emphasize both the virtues and the vices of of society, they tended in practice to mention mostly the vices. So you feel that in both countries very, very keenly. Now, by science, this varied a little bit. In France, there was more of a physiologist's approach to character and to human behavior. In America, some of the writers, like Frank Norrisi particularly, went into a certain amount of pseudoscience, which was considered science in those days. Things like phrenology and criminal atavism, Cesare Lombroso's theory of criminal atavism, something that is passed on, from father to son, hereditary criminality, right? So that kind of pseudoscience tended to flourish a little bit in America, but mostly in the work of Frank Norrisi. So here we see one of the first differences in that American naturalists did document themselves as much as French naturalists did, but in the end they don't emphasize the absolute overriding truth of scientific perspectives. There is a kind of withdrawal from science in some of the American writers. They don't, posit absolute authority, or they don't place absolute authority in a scientific explanation of human behavior. Frank Norrisi, for instance, mentions God and notions of evil. So there is a sense in which there is something unknowable that even science cannot explain in human behavior. So that's, let's say that in French literature, you have a tendency in a lot of French naturalist writers to emphasize science, as I said, but also the perspective of the poor person. Whereas often in American literature, American naturalist literature, you have the feeling that the author is looking down on the character and judging the character. And so this is probably the main difference between the two. And this is probably linked to the fact that the British novel in the 19th century tended to have authorial intrusions. You see this in William Thackeray, Charles Dickens, and other writers, and other British writers. And it's been said that this might come from the public perception that if literature doesn't preach to you, then it is a kind of idle practice. So there is that Protestant idea that literature has to point a moral, and the author is not only allowed to, but should intervene to comment in a very, moralistic way at times. So that is something that Zola tended to avoid. In French literature, you have this, since Gustave Flaubert, a tendency to move away from authorial intrusion. Flaubert, as you know, pointed out that the author should be like God, present everywhere but invisible. And so in a book like L'Assommoir, Zola achieves that kind of effect. The author's, the narrator's words even are taken often from the language of the people. So that is probably one of the major differences. Say if you take McTeague by Frank Norrisi, Norrisi tends to look down on his character. He often points out how stupid he is. what a slave he is to his emotions. He even says that he is evil, right? That's the kind of word that Zola wouldn't use, with its religious overtones. So that's one of the major differences. Now, another central difference is that American naturalists did not follow Zola's emphasis on absolute ordinariness. In Zola, you have a tendency to focus on the lives of the ordinary people, but also very ordinary occurrences. He tends to eschew, right, to avoid anything too sensational, anything out of the ordinary. So instead of melodrama and sensationalism, what Zola gives us is determinism. The story is predictable. You can guess it unfolding, especially after, say, in L'Assommoir, Coupeau, the hero falls off the roof. Right, he's a roofer, and he falls off a roof, and that damages him completely. He's no longer able to work, and then you can predict that he's going to sink into poverty, and this is going to drag Gervaise, his wife, down into the depths, which it does, right? So it's very predictable. Whereas in, say, McTeague, you have a very unpredictable ending, and there's also suspense, and which is something that Zola tended to forego. Right? He wasn't really interested in suspense. So he wanted to create a novel that was as lifelike as possible, as unartful, as unliterary as possible, right? So getting rid of things like mystery, suspense, twist endings, right? That was not at all what he was interested in. Whereas McTeague does use all those novelistic procedures, right, to keep the reader gripped. And the hero is larger than life. Even though he's not very bright and not particularly resourceful, he is a kind of giant, right? He's got immense strength, so he's slightly out of the ordinary in that respect. We don't look up to him as a hero. He's obviously an anti-hero, but he does have this kind of superpower. It's a kind of anticipation, you could say, of the American fascination for the extraordinary, right? The Superman. So he is this very brutish, massive, powerfully built character, and it serves him well until the very end, when even his strength will not prevail. So American heroes in the naturalist novels tend to die in extraordinary circumstances. In the middle of Death Valley, with nothing to drink, or lost in the ice lands of the Yukon, in northwest Canada, next to Alaska there, trapped in ice. They'll die in wheat silos, right, covered in wheat, right. They'll drown in the wheat silo, things like that. So that's something that the Americans didn't follow, that interest in the very, very mundane, right? By mundane, I mean ordinary. And the last major difference between American and French naturalism was a very American phenomenon, which is the American dream. French heroes or anti-heroes in the novels don't tend to have that kind of aspiration, right? They don't aspire to great riches. They don't really aspire to climb up the social ladder. They know that they're going to stay poor, All they want is just to, get by and, have a fairly decent life. Whereas in America, you have this the American dream, right? Which this kind of semi-myth, especially nowadays. But even in the 19th century, there were few real success stories, few real rags to riches stories. But it fueled people. It made them feel that they should aspire to that, which often led to tragedies that were linked to that desire to make it big, to transcend the human condition. So there was a tendency to emphasize the fact that these characters are the dupes of the American dream, and that ultimately they fail more miserably because of this desire to aspire beyond their class. Thank you.